The rattle of the stagecoach wheels over frozen ruts was the only sound Evelyn had truly known for days. It was a harsh, rhythmic language of jolts and groans that had worked its way into her bones. A constant reminder of the distance she had put between herself and a past she prayed was finally dead. When the wheels at last fell silent, the quiet that followed was a different kind of jarring. It was a cold, empty silence that seeped through the cracks in the worn leather flaps of the coach. She pushed aside the flap and drew a sharp, stinging breath. The air in Wyoming territory tasted of pine and coming snow, a clean, wild scent so different from the coal-choked air of the east she had fled. The town, if one could call it that, was a single muddy street carved between two rows of rough-hewn wooden buildings. Their false fronts stood like tombstones against a vast, gray sky that promised a long winter. Men in dusty coats and low-brimmed hats stopped their work, their conversations, to turn and stare. Their eyes were hard, appraising, and held no welcome. Evelyn smoothed the front of her dark woolen traveling dress, her fingers trembling slightly, beneath her gloved hands. She could feel the crinkle of the letter tucked into her bodice, the paper worn soft from 100 readings. It was her map, her proof, her promise of a new life. Beside her on the hard bench sat a small, battered trunk containing everything she owned in the world, the most precious of which was a simple wedding dress of ivory muslin, folded carefully and wrapped in linen. The driver, a heavy-set man named Silas with a beard full of ice, swung her trunk down into the mud with a grunt. "This is it, Miss Redemption." End of the line. Redemption. The name felt like a cruel joke. She stepped down onto the muddy plank walk, her boots sinking slightly, and clutched the handle of her trunk. Her gaze swept over the unsmiling faces, searching for one that matched the faded photograph she carried. A man with kind eyes and a shy smile. Mr. Calvin Bryce. Her intended. "I'm looking for Mr. Bryce," she said, her voice small in the vast, cold air. "He was to meet me." Silas spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Folks around here mostly wet their whistle at the saloon when they're waitin'." He gestured with a thumb toward a wide building with swinging doors, from which came the tinny sound of a poorly played piano. "McCrory's, ask in there." With a nod of thanks she did not feel, Evelyn dragged her trunk toward the saloon, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Each step felt heavy, each stare a physical weight upon her shoulders. She was a curiosity, a lone woman in a world of hard men. The piano music stopped the moment she pushed through the doors. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and wood smoke. Every man at the bar, at the rough plank tables, turned to look at her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of melting snow from a man's coat. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the broad-shouldered man behind the bar who was wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "Pardon me," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for Mr. Calvin Bryce. I was told he might be here." The bartender stopped wiping the glass. He set it down with a deliberate thud. His eyes, small and dark, held a look that was not unkind, but weary, as if he had seen too much sorrow to be surprised by more. "Who's asking?" "My name is Evelyn Gable. I am his fiancée." The words felt strange and momentous on her tongue. "He sent for me." A low murmur rippled through the room. A man at a nearby table chuckled into his beer. The bartender's expression softened into something that looked dangerously like pity. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you've had a long journey for nothing." Evelyn's gloved hand went to her throat. "What do you mean?" "Calvin Bryce is dead, miss," he said, the words clean and sharp as a shard of glass. "His cabin burned to the ground 2 weeks back. He was inside." The world tilted. The smoky air grew thin, the faces of the men blurring into a single, staring mask. Dead? It was not possible. The letter in her bodice felt like a burning coal against her skin. It was dated just 6 weeks ago, full of plans for their small farm, for the home they would build. He had written of the green hills in spring and the clear, star-filled nights. He had not written of fire. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you must be mistaken. I have a letter." "Ain't no mistake." A raspy voice cut in from the side. A grizzled trapper with one eye milky and blind spoke up. Whole valley saw the smoke, went up like a torch in the night. Her legs felt weak, the floor unsteady beneath her feet. She leaned a hand against a wooden post to steady herself. The room began to swim back into focus. And with it, the whispers. They were not murmurs of sympathy, but of cruel speculation. "Another mail-order bride? Too late to the prize? Look at her. Bet she thought she'd landed a man with property." "Gold digger," a woman's sharp voice hissed from a dark corner where 2 of the saloon girls sat watching. "Got what she deserved." Another man, his face flushed with drink, looked her up and down with a greasy smile. "Well, now, a woman all alone. No need to be lonely, little lady." The bartender shot the man a glare that could have soured milk. "That's enough. Jeb, show the lady some respect." He turned back to Evelyn, his face grim. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss, truly, but there's nothing for you here." Numb, she turned and stumbled back out into the street, leaving her trunk where it stood. The cold was a shock, but it did nothing to clear the fog in her mind. Dead. The word echoed and echoed. Her meticulously planned future, her one desperate gamble for a life of her own, had burned to ashes with a man she had never even met. She was stranded, penniless, and utterly alone in a place that already hated her for reasons she couldn't comprehend. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pierce through the shock. Where would she go? What would she do? Her mind seized on the one place that was supposed to offer sanctuary to the lost and the grieving. The church. A small, white-steepled building stood at the far end of the street, its cross a dark slash against the oppressive sky. She walked toward it, her steps mechanical. The whispers of the townsfolk followed her like stray dogs. They saw her fine, if simple, dress, the careful way she held herself, and they judged it as arrogance. They saw a woman without a man's protection, and they judged her as either a fool or a temptation. The pastor was a thin, reedy man with pale eyes and a nervous habit of wringing his hands. He listened to her story with a pinched expression, his gaze darting around the empty pews as if he feared a member of his congregation might walk in and find him speaking to this sullied creature. "A terrible tragedy. Miss Gable," he said, his voice smooth and hollow. "A truly terrible business. Calvin Bryce was, well, he was a member of this community. I have nowhere to go, Reverend," Evelyn said, her voice raw with desperation. "I spent my last dollar on the passage here. I only ask for a place to stay for a night or two, until I can decide what to do." The pastor's hands twisted together. "That is difficult. We have no parish house to speak of. The town is small, and tongues do wag. A single woman, it would not be proper." "Proper?" The word was a slap. "I am destitute. I am grieving for a man I was to marry. What is not proper about the church offering shelter?" He saw the fire in her eyes and took a step back. Of course. Christian charity demands it. There is a small cot in the back room, where we store the hymnals and candles. It is cold, I'm afraid, and not very comfortable, but you are welcome to it, for a night." The dismissal was clear. He was offering the barest minimum required by his station, a cold corner to a problem he wished would simply disappear. The humiliation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had not come here begging for charity. She had come as a bride, to build a home. She left the church without another word, the offer of the cold cot feeling more like an insult than a kindness. She stood on the church steps, watching the gray light fade from the sky. Snow had begun to fall. lazy flakes that melted on the muddy ground. Her hope, so carefully nurtured over 1,000 miles, was gone. There was nothing left but a cold, aching void. She was so lost in her misery that she didn't see the man stumbling out of the saloon until he was right in front of her. It was Jeb, the one who had made the lewd comment earlier. His face was redder now, his eyes glazed over with drink. "Well, looky here," he slurred, blocking her path. "It's the late bride. You find your dead man yet?" Evelyn tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again, a foul grin on his face. "No need to be in such a hurry. A pretty thing like you shouldn't be all alone. I can keep you warm." "Leave me alone," she said, her voice tight with fear. He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Playing hard to get, are we? You came all this way for a man. I'm a man. What's the difference?" He reached out and grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away, but his grip was strong. In the struggle, he gave her a hard shove. Her feet slipped in the mud and snow. She cried out as she fell backward, landing hard in the freezing slush. The cold seeped through her dress instantly, a brutal shock to her system. Laughter erupted from the men watching from the saloon doorway. She was a spectacle, a joke. The shame was a physical blow, harder than the fall itself. As Jeb took a lurching step toward her, a shadow fell over them both. A man had stepped out from the side of the general store, moving with a silence that was startling. He was tall and broad, dressed in worn buckskins and a heavy sheepskin coat. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see a square jaw and a mouth set in a hard, unyielding line. He did not say a word. He simply placed a hand on Jeb's shoulder. It was not a violent gesture, but there was an authority in it that made the drunken man freeze. Jeb turned, his bravado faltering as he looked up at the newcomer. The tall man just looked at him. His eyes, in the dim light, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. After a long moment, Jeb seemed to shrink. He mumbled something under his breath and shuffled away, disappearing back into the warmth of the saloon. The laughter from the doorway died. The silent man looked down at Evelyn, still sitting in the wet snow. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone. He made no move to help her up. He just watched, his gaze taking in her soiled dress, her pale face, her trembling hands. She felt exposed, stripped bare by his scrutiny. This was Eli Maddox, though she did not know his name. A cowboy who kept to himself. A man who had seen the orange glow of Calvin Bryce's cabin against the night sky and had been the first to ride up to the smoking ruins. Scrambling to her feet, her dress heavy and dripping, Evelyn brushed the snow from her skirts, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She would not let this man see her cry. "Thank you," she mumbled, not meeting his eyes. He gave a short, curt nod. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "This town ain't a place for you." "I have nowhere else to go," she said, the words a stark, miserable truth. He looked down the street, then back at her. A muscle worked in his jaw. "It'll get worse when night falls proper. You need to be gone." She finally looked up at him, a spark of anger cutting through her despair. "Gone where? Am I supposed to simply walk into the wilderness and perish? Would that satisfy this town's sense of order?" A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, crossed his face before it was gone. He seemed to consider her for a moment, his gaze intense. "I got a wagon at the livery. I'm heading out to my ranch. You can ride with me." The offer was so unexpected, so stark, it left her speechless. Ride with him? A complete stranger? A man who looked as hard and unforgiving as the land itself? Every instinct she had, every lesson taught to a woman alone, screamed at her to refuse. But then she looked around at the leering faces in the saloon window, thought of the pastor's cold charity, and felt the icy water seeping into her bones. What other choice did she have? "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you help me?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked toward the distant, snow-dusted mountains, his expression bleak. "No one deserves to freeze to death in a gutter," he said finally. As if the reason were that simple, that practical. He turned and started walking toward the livery stable without waiting for her answer, assuming she would follow. Left with the choice between a known hostility and an unknown danger, she chose the unknown. She retrieved her trunk from the saloon porch, dragging it through the mud and ignoring the renewed stares. By the time she reached the livery, he had a rugged buckboard wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He took her trunk without a word and heaved it into the back, then helped her up onto the hard wooden seat. The gesture was impersonal, efficient, like loading a sack of flour. The journey out of town was silent. The last of the daylight bled from the sky, leaving the world in shades of blue and gray. The trail was little more than 2 ruts in the snow, winding away from the town's feeble lights and into a vast, empty landscape. The cold intensified, biting at any exposed skin. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter, her body shivering uncontrollably, as much from shock as from the temperature. She tried to fill the heavy silence between them. It felt like a chasm she had to bridge. "It's beautiful country," she offered, her voice thin against the wind. He grunted in response. She tried again. "My fiancé, Mr. Bryce, he wrote about it in his letters. He said the silence was peaceful." At the mention of Calvin's name, Eli's hands tightened on the reins. He remained quiet, his profile a stark silhouette against the snow. His silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable. To Evelyn, it felt like judgment. She imagined he was thinking the same things as the others, that she was a fool or an opportunist. She did not know that his silence was a shroud for his own grief, a heavy blanket of guilt and sorrow connected to the very fire that had orphaned her future. The miles crawled by. The only sounds were the crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow, the creak of the wagon, and the mournful sigh of the wind through the skeletal branches of cottonwood trees. Finally, she saw a light in the distance, a single, flickering yellow square in a sea of darkness. It was a cabin, nestled in a small valley against the backdrop of a towering, black mountain. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. Eli pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand rough and calloused on her arm, his touch lasting no longer than necessary. The cabin was small, built of dark, weathered logs, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. It looked sturdy, a fortress against the wilderness. He pushed the door open, and a wave of warmth and the smell of wood smoke and coffee washed over her. It was a simple, one-room space, sparsely furnished but clean. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She stepped over the threshold, her body trembling with cold, with fear, with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness. Here was a fire, here was a roof, here was safety from the snow and the leering men. But here, too, was a new and terrifying uncertainty. Trapped in this isolated place with a silent, brooding stranger, all the pain of the day, of the past years, rose up in her throat. The loss of a future she desperately needed, the sting of a town's scorn, the deep, aching loneliness that was her oldest companion. It was a familiar hurt, a pain she'd lived with for so long it felt like a part of her. And yet, the warmth of the fire, the solidness of the 4 walls around her, promised a reprieve she wanted so badly it was a physical craving. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the broken pieces together. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She whispered the words to the shadows, to the crackling fire, to the man who stood watching her from the doorway. "It hurts, yet I crave it." Eli heard her, his expression unchanged. He closed the door, shutting out the wind and the vast, cold darkness. He walked past her to the hearth, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he turned and held out his hand. It was not a gesture of comfort, not of romance, but of simple direction, a guide in the darkness. Hesitantly, her fingers still numb with cold, she reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused from work and weather, but it was warm and solid. It was an anchor in the storm that was her life. As her fingers closed around his, she stepped further into the cabin, marking the beginning of an uneasy, unspoken agreement in the heart of the unforgiving Wyoming winter. The days that followed fell into a quiet, fragile rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of a sun that offered little warmth. Evelyn, unwilling to be a mere burden, found her place in the small cabin's daily chores. She rose before dawn, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet, and coaxed the embers in the hearth back to life. The fire became her domain, a living thing she tended with a devotion born of a desperate need for its heat and light. In exchange for the shelter of his roof, she became the keeper of his home. She cooked, making what she could from his meager stores of flour, beans, and salted meat. The meals were simple, often eaten in a silence that was as thick as the winter stew she served. She mended his clothes, her needle moving with a practiced skill honed over years in an orphanage where every girl had to earn her keep. Her stitches were small and neat, closing the rips in his worn canvas trousers and frayed wool shirts. Each act was a silent payment, a way of saying, I am earning this space, this warmth, this moment of safety. Outside the cabin walls, the world was a study in brutal simplicity. The Wyoming landscape, stripped of its summer green, was an unforgiving expanse of white and gray. The wind was a constant presence, a mournful beast that howled through the pines and rattled the single glass pane of the window. Some nights, its cry was answered by another, a sound that made the hairs on Evelyn's arms stand on end, the distant, hungry call of wolves. And always, there was the snow. It fell for days without end, a soft, relentless siege that buried the world, piling in great drifts against the cabin door and further isolating them from a world that had already cast her out. The cabin itself was Eli's silence made manifest. It was a space built for purpose, not comfort. A sturdy table and 2 chairs, a rope-sprung bed in one corner where he slept, and a smaller cot near the fire, which he had wordlessly offered to her. Yet, amid the masculine austerity, there were traces of a life that had come before, specters of a softer time. On a wooden peg near the door, a woman's scarf still hung, woven from a fine, faded blue wool. It was a sliver of color in the otherwise drab room, a ghost of a scent she could sometimes imagine on the air. On a small, dusty shelf above his bed sat a handful of books, collections of poetry, and a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. They were things of a delicate world, and they did not belong to the hard man who now inhabited this space. They belonged to his late wife. Evelyn never asked about her. She sensed the pain surrounding the memory was a sleeping bear best left undisturbed. She would clean around the scarf, wipe the dust from the book covers, but she would not press. His grief was his own, a private territory she had no right to enter. She was a guest here, a temporary fixture, and she understood the boundaries of unspoken sorrow. She was haunted by her own ghosts. After all, they came to her in the quiet moments, when she was kneading dough or staring into the flames of the fire. Flashes of the orphanage, a cold, gray building where kindness was a currency rarer than gold. The pinched face of the matron, whose hands were quick with a ruler. The constant, gnawing hunger. Then came the memories of her time as a scullery maid in the city. The heavy, groping hands of her employer's husband, a man who saw her as another piece of property to be used. She remembered the night he had cornered her in the pantry, his breath sour with brandy, telling her he could give her a much better life than the one she had. He had tried to buy her, not with marriage, but with coin and a squalid arrangement that would have made her his creature. That was the night she had run. That was the night she had seen the advertisement for mail-order brides, a last, desperate gamble for a clean life, a life where she might be valued for more than the use of her body. One evening, The fire was burning low, and Eli came in from the barn, his shoulders dusted with fresh snow. He pulled his heavy coat off and began to unbutton his shirt, the damp wool clinging to him. Evelyn, who was mending a tear in a grain sack, kept her eyes down, granting him the illusion of privacy the small cabin could not offer. But as he turned to hang the shirt near the hearth to dry, the firelight caught the skin of his side. She saw it for only a second, but the image was seared into her mind, a puckered, angry scar, wide as a man's hand, swirling across his ribs. It was a burn, old but vicious. Her breath hitched. She could not stop the gasp that escaped her lips. He froze, his back still to her. He had felt her gaze as surely as if she had touched him. Slowly, he turned his head, his face shrouded in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his eyes on her. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with a sudden, dangerous energy. The silence, once a neutral space, was now filled with questions she dared not ask and a history he would not tell. He pulled on a dry shirt without a word, the moment passing, but not before a new line of tension had been drawn between them. A few nights later, the wind was particularly savage, throwing handfuls of snow against the cabin like pebbles. They had finished their silent supper, and the darkness outside was absolute. Eli sat cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. Evelyn sat across the table, her hands idle in her lap. The silence felt different tonight, heavier. "The snow is deep," she said, simply to hear a voice. He nodded, not looking up from his work. "It'll bring the desperate ones down from the hills." "Desperate ones?" "Cattle thieves, men who didn't provision for a hard winter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ranches on the North Range have lost a dozen head already. A man has to be watchful." He spoke of a world of practical dangers, of tangible threats one could face with a rifle and a watchful eye. It was a world Evelyn did not know, but she understood the language of desperation. "I was desperate when I answered Mr. Bryce's letter," she confessed, the words spilling out into the quiet space before she could stop them. "The train ride west, it was my last hope. I had nothing to go back to." He finally stopped his work and looked at her, truly looked at her. His gaze was steady, unpitying, but attentive. For the first time, he seemed to see her not as a problem he had inherited, but as a person with a story. "Most folks who come out here are running from something," he said. "And you?" The question was bold, but the fragile intimacy of the moment propelled her. "Are you running from something, Mr. Maddox?" A shuddered look came over his face, and he returned his attention to the rifle. "Everyone's got ghosts. Best to let them lie." The conversation was over, but a small seed had been planted in the barren ground of their silence. He had shared a piece of his world, and she had shared a piece of her fear. The weight of her obligation to him pressed on her constantly. He had saved her from the street, given her food and shelter, and asked for nothing in return. But in Evelyn's world, nothing was ever given for free. Every kindness had a price, and she had been taught that a woman's only true currency was her body. The thought shamed her, but it was a deeply ingrained lesson. She lay on her cot night after night, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from the other side of the room, her mind in turmoil. One night, the turmoil became unbearable. He had spent the day repairing a section of fence in the biting wind, and he had returned exhausted, his face chapped and raw from the cold. He ate his supper quickly and sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. The silence was profound, filled with his unspoken grief and her unspoken debt. She could not bear it another moment. She rose from the table and walked over to where he sat. She stood before him, her hands clenched at her sides. He looked up, his expression wary. "Mr. Maddox," she began, her voice trembling. I cannot continue to accept your charity without repayment." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You earn your keep. You cook. You clean." "It is not enough," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You have given me shelter, protection. I have nothing to offer you. No money." She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to say the words that her past had taught her were expected. "But I am not without means to repay your kindness." She let her gaze fall, unable to look at him as she offered the only thing of value she believed she possessed. The implication hung in the air between them, ugly and unmistakable. For a long moment, Eli was completely still, his face like a mask carved from granite. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry, but cold, flat and sharp, with an intensity that cut her to the bone. "You don't owe me your skin." The words were a slap, a brutal rejection of the shameful bargain she had tried to make. He stood up, his height towering over her, and his eyes were chips of ice. "I am not one of those men. This is not that kind of house. Do you understand me?" Shame, hot and overwhelming, flooded through her. He had seen the ugly calculation in her heart, and he had thrown it back in her face. He was not like the others. He was a man of honor, and she had insulted him in the most profound way possible. Tears pricked at her eyes. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I did not mean—" But the world was suddenly tilting, the edges of her vision going dark. The fire in the hearth seemed to recede, becoming a distant point of light. The exhaustion of the journey, the shock of Calvin's death, the days of tension and fear, it all came crashing down on her at once. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and her legs gave way. He caught her before she hit the floor, his strong arms breaking her fall. The last thing she remembered was the rough texture of his shirt against her cheek, and the surprising, steady beat of his heart. When she woke, it was in fits and starts. She was on her cot, covered with every blanket in the cabin. The room was dark, save for the low, steady glow of the fire. She was burning up, a fever raging through her, making her shiver and sweat at the same time. Nightmarish images flickered behind her eyelids, the matron's cruel face, the leering grin of her former employer, the cold, muddy street of redemption. Through the haze of the fever, she was aware of movement, of a presence nearby. Once, she opened her eyes to see Eli sitting in the chair beside her cot, a wet cloth in his hand. He was wringing it out in a basin of cool water. He leaned over and gently laid the cloth on her forehead. His touch was hesitant, careful, the touch of a man unaccustomed to gentleness. He did not speak. He just sat with her, his vigil a silent, steady presence in the long, dark night. Another time, she awoke thirsty, her throat a desert. Before she could even try to form the word for water, a cup was at her lips, and he was helping her to sit up, his arm supporting her back. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. As she lay back down, her head fell against his shoulder for a moment. He was solid, real. He smelled of wood smoke and pine and cold winter air. It was a scent of safety. He cared for her through the night and into the next day. He fed her broth, kept the fire stoked, and regularly changed the cool cloths on her forehead. He never touched her improperly, never took advantage of her weakness. His hands, when they brushed her skin, were clinical and brief, but his care was absolute. He was tending to her as one would tend to a wounded animal, with a gruff, practical compassion that was more comforting than any flowery words could ever be. Her fever finally broke on the second night. She woke to find the cabin quiet, the first pale light of dawn filtering through the window. Eli was asleep in his chair, his head slumped to one side, a rifle laid across his lap. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened, but he still looked weary, as if rest offered him no real peace. She lay there, watching him, her body weak but her mind clear for the first time in days. He had rejected her shameful offer. Yet, when she had fallen, he had caught her. He had tended to her with a quiet, selfless devotion. He had stayed by her side and nursed her back from the brink. A new kind of intimacy had been forged between them in the crucible of her fever. An intimacy that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and he had not harmed her. She had seen a glimpse of the decent man hidden beneath the calloused, silent exterior. The physical desire that had crackled in the air between them before was still there, a low, simmering heat beneath the surface. But now, it was complicated by something deeper, something more frightening and more precious, a fragile, burgeoning trust. The weakness left her slowly, like a tide going out, leaving behind a clean-swept shore. In the days following her fever, Evelyn felt the world come back into sharp focus. The scent of pine from the firewood was crisper, the taste of water was sweeter, and the silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer a heavy, smothering blanket, but a shared space, a quiet territory they both occupied with a new, unspoken awareness of each other. She was stronger, and the balance of their cohabitation had subtly shifted. She was no longer just a victim he had rescued, but a woman he had nursed back to health. She noticed his new project one morning when a different sound broke the stillness. It was not the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, but the clean, shaving sound of a blade against fresh timber. She looked out the small window and saw him standing in the lee of the barn, protected from the biting wind. He was working on a long, pale pine board, his powerful shoulders moving with a steady grace as he drew a sharp blade along its length, peeling away perfect, fragrant curls of wood. Several other finished boards lay stacked neatly beside him. Her heart gave a strange, painful lurch. She knew, without having to ask, what they were for. They were for a new floor, new walls. They were for rebuilding the cabin that had burned on the hill, the one that should have been her home. He was working to restore a life that had been promised to her, a life that had been destroyed before it could begin. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out into the cold. The air was sharp and clean in her lungs. He did not stop his work as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "You are rebuilding it," she said, her voice a small cloud in the frigid air. It was not a question. He finished a long, smooth pass with the draw knife before he answered, his eyes on the grain of the wood. "Land's no good without a roof over it." "It was his land," she said softly. "Mr. Bryce's." "It's no one's land now," he replied, his voice gruff. "Just a patch of scorched earth." She watched his hands, strong and calloused, as they expertly guided the blade. They were the same hands that had so carefully laid cool cloths on her forehead, the same hands that had held a cup of water to her lips. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to help, to take part in this act of creation that seemed to be his answer to all the destruction. "I can help," she offered. He paused and finally looked at her. His winter sky eyes were searching, as if trying to gauge her sincerity or her strength. "This is man's work." "Sanding is not," she countered, her chin lifting slightly. "I can sand the board smooth. It will make the work go faster." He considered her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. She expected a refusal, another curt dismissal. Instead, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and gestured with his head toward a pile of smaller wood blocks and worn pieces of sandcloth near the barn wall. "There's the tools. Don't let your hands get raw." It was not an enthusiastic acceptance, but it was an acceptance nonetheless. A door had been opened, just a crack. For the rest of the day, she worked beside him. She did not try to make conversation, sensing that the shared labor was a language he understood better than words. She took one of the finished boards and began to sand, her movements rhythmic and steady. The scrape of her sanding block and the shave of his knife became a kind of quiet duet against the backdrop of the whispering wind. She was no longer just the keeper of his hearth. She was a partner, however small, in his work. The need for supplies finally forced them from their isolated valley. Their stores of flour and salt were running low, and the winter was far from over. The trip back to Redemption was a thing Evelyn dreaded, but it was a necessity they could not avoid. The silence in the buckboard on the way to town was different from their first journey. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the more complex silence of two people who had shared a sickness, a secret, and a quiet workspace. It was thick with unspoken things. As they pulled onto the main street, Evelyn felt the familiar weight of hostile stares. Heads turned. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass. The gossip, it seemed, had not died down in their absence. It had festered. Eli pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, his face an unreadable mask. "Stay in the wagon," he commanded, his voice low. "I can get the supplies," she said. "It is my place to—" "Stay in the wagon," he repeated, and there was an edge to his voice that told her not to argue. He swung down and strode toward the store, his presence a silent challenge to the watching town. He had barely disappeared inside when a group of men emerged from the saloon across the street. There were 4 of them, their faces hard and chapped from the wind, their coats bearing the dust of the trail. They were ranchers, their manner proprietary and arrogant. They walked directly toward the wagon, their boots thudding on the plank walk. Evelyn's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The leader was a tall, gaunt man with a severe face and a beard streaked with gray. His name was Jedediah Kane, a man who saw the world in black and white and judged all he saw. He stopped beside the wagon and looked down at Evelyn, his eyes cold and devoid of pity. "You're still here, then," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Evelyn clutched her shawl, her knuckles white. "I have no other place to be." "This is a decent town, ma'am," Kane said, though his tone suggested she was the source of some indecency. "We don't take kindly to complications." A younger, hot-headed man beside him spat on the ground. "Complication? She's a whore, shacked up with a man who ain't her husband. Plain and simple." "That is not true," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. Just then, the door to the general store opened, and Eli stepped out, a heavy sack of flour on one shoulder. He saw the men surrounding his wagon, and his body went still. He set the sack down slowly, deliberately, and walked toward them. He did not hurry. His movements were calm, measured, but carried a threat more potent than any shouted words. "Kane," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "You got business with me?" Jedediah Kane turned his cold gaze on Eli. "Maddox, we're here as concerned citizens. You're harboring a fallen woman at your ranch. It ain't right. It brings a stain on the community." "What I do on my land is my business," Eli said, his eyes never leaving Kane's. "And the lady is under my protection. Her name is Miss Gable." The younger man laughed. "Miss Gable? She's a mail-order bride whose groom had the good sense to die before she got here. Now she's latched onto you. What are you getting in return for your protection?" "Maddox?" Eli took one step forward, and the man's smirk vanished. The air crackled. Evelyn could see the muscles in Eli's jaw bunching. He looked like a wolf about to spring. "You'll send her away," Kane said, his voice hard. "Put her on the next stagecoach east. It's for the best, for her, and for you." "No," Eli said. The word was flat, final. "Now get away from my wagon." For a long moment, no one moved. It was a standoff, a battle of wills played out in the cold winter air. The ranchers looked from Eli's unyielding face to the determined set of his shoulders and seemed to make a collective decision. They were not ready for the kind of trouble Eli Maddox promised. With a final, contemptuous glare at Evelyn, Jedediah Kane turned, and the other men followed him back toward the saloon. Eli stood watching them go, his fists still clenched at his sides. He then turned and, without a word to Evelyn, went back into the store for the rest of the supplies. Evelyn sat trembling in the wagon, a storm of emotions raging inside her. He had defended her. He had stood against those men and claimed her as being under his protection. He had called her Miss Gable, a title of respect she had not heard since she arrived. Why? Why would he invite the town's wrath for a woman who was nothing to him? When he returned, his arms laden with parcels, she decided she could not just sit there. She could not let him bear this alone. "I will go into the store," she said, her voice firm. "There are some things, some womanly things I require. I will not be long." He looked at her, and for a second, she thought he would refuse. But he gave a curt nod and went to load the parcels into the back of the wagon. She slid down and walked on unsteady legs toward the store, her head held high. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. The storekeeper's wife, a plump woman named Mrs. Peterson, gave her a cool, assessing look but said nothing. 2 other women were standing by the fabric bolts, their heads close together, whispering, as Evelyn passed them, pretending to inspect a display of canned peaches. Their words floated to her, sharp and clear as icicles. "Saw him, I tell you. My Henry saw him plain as day," one of the women was saying, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "Riding away from the Bryce cabin that night, hard and fast. The whole sky was lit up orange behind him." The other woman gasped. "You don't think—" "Everyone knows there was bad blood between him and Calvin Bryce. Haven't spoken a civil word in 2 years. And now, this bride of Bryce's shows up. And Maddox takes her in. It's mighty convenient, is all I'm saying. Mighty convenient that Calvin's out of the way." The world seemed to drop out from under Evelyn's feet. She gripped the edge of the shelf to keep from falling. Eli. They were talking about Eli. They were accusing him of setting the fire, of murder, riding away from the blaze, not toward it. The words echoed the cruelest thoughts of the townsfolk. It was an impossible, monstrous thought, but it landed in her mind like a venomous seed. The burn scar on his side, his silence about Calvin, his presence at the cabin so soon after the fire. A terrible, sickening picture began to form. She bought her things in a daze, paid Mrs. Peterson with the small amount of money Eli had given her, and walked back out into the cold. The ride back to the cabin was a torment. The silence in the wagon was no longer quiet or companionable. It was a screaming void filled with her unspoken fear and suspicion. She stole glances at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw and the bleakness in his eyes. Was this the face of a killer? A man who would burn another alive? Her heart screamed no, but the whispers of the town were a poison in her ear. That night, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. Every crackle of the fire, every gust of wind outside, seemed to amplify the terrible question that lay between them. She could not eat. She could not sit still. She watched him as he cleaned his tack, his movements as calm and methodical as always. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "The townspeople," she began, her voice tight and unnatural. "They are saying things—" He did not look up. "Let them talk. Their words are air." "They are saying the fire that killed Mr. Bryce was not an accident." His hands stilled. He slowly set down the piece of leather he was oiling and lifted his head. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making him look like a stranger. "And what else are they saying?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She took a breath, her heart pounding. "They are saying you were there that night, that you were seen." He held her gaze for a long, unflinching moment. He did not deny it. "I was there," he said. The simple admission struck her like a physical blow. "Then it's true," she whispered, a horrible cold dread spreading through her. "What's true?" he asked, his eyes hard as flint. "That I killed him?" He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "No, I didn't kill Calvin, but I might as well have." He stood up and walked to the hearth, turning his back to her to stare into the flames. When he finally spoke, His voice was raw, dredged up from a place of deep and profound pain. Calvin and we grew up together. Our fathers ranched side by side. We were like brothers, once. But something in him curdled as he got older. He grew mean. He took to hard drink and gambling. He saw cruelty as strength. He paused, running a hand over his face. He started hiring young boys, runaways mostly, because he could pay them next to nothing and work them half to death. No one would miss them if they disappeared. There was one, a boy named Daniel. He couldn't have been more than 15. Calvin took a dislike to him. I saw the bruises on the boy. I warned Calvin to leave him be. We had words, vicious words. That was the last time we spoke as friends. Evelyn listened, her fear slowly being replaced by a dawning, aching sadness. The night of the fire, Eli continued, his voice barely a whisper. I was riding back from the high country. I saw the glow against the sky and I rode toward it. When I got there, the whole cabin was an inferno. Calvin was already gone. The roof had collapsed on him. But Daniel, the boy, he was in the loft. I could hear him screaming. Eli's broad shoulders shook with a repressed shudder. The front of the cabin was blocked. I went around the back, kicked in the wall. The heat was like a physical thing, pushing me back. I could see him, through the smoke and the flames. I got to him. I had my hands on him. He held up his own hands, staring at them as if they were foreign objects. I had him, and I lost him. A burning beam fell between us. It knocked me back, set my shirt on fire. I couldn't get back to him. I had to get out or burn myself. I stood outside and I listened to him die. The story ended. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the fire, the burn scar, the guilt that haunted his eyes. It all made a terrible kind of sense. He was not a murderer. He was a man who believed he had failed to be a savior. He turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with a self-loathing so profound it made her ache. So you see, Miss Gable, the town is right. There is bad blood. I carry the ghost of that boy every day. A man like that, he doesn't deserve comfort. He doesn't deserve a home, and he sure as hell doesn't deserve the company of a good woman. His confession hung in the air. A raw, open wound. He had shown her his deepest scar, the one that burned him from the inside out. And in that moment, Evelyn knew she had to show him hers. Slowly, deliberately, she began to unbutton the cuffs of her dress. Then, she pulled off her gloves, the simple wool gloves she wore constantly, even inside. She placed them on the table and held her hands out toward the firelight. Eli stared, his own pain momentarily forgotten. Her skin, from her wrists halfway to her elbows, was a latticework of old scars. They were thin, white lines, like tangled threads beneath the skin, the unmistakable marks of a lash. You think I'm clean? I'm not, she said, her voice low and steady, stripped of all artifice. Where I came from, a girl who tried to run from a man who thought he owned her was taught a lesson. I learned my lesson well. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her gaze was fierce. We are both scarred. Mr. Maddox, you and I, they have judged us, this town, and they have found us wanting. They call me a fallen bride, and they call you a killer, but they don't see the truth. I see it. She took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. You look at me, and you don't see a soiled woman. You don't see a debt to be collected. You still look at me like I'm something worth saving. The space between them vanished. He moved without thinking. She met him without hesitation. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. It was a touch full of a terrible, desperate longing. Her own hands came up to rest on his chest, where she could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers. Their kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of pain and need, of two lonely, damaged souls finding a mirror in each other. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the scent of wood smoke on his skin. It was a raw, desperate claiming, a silent acknowledgement of the broken pieces they both carried. It was a kiss that hurt, a kiss that healed, a kiss that promised nothing but the shared reality of this single, fragile moment. It went on for a long, breathless time, a desperate exploration in the flickering firelight, but then, as if by some unspoken, mutual consent, they broke apart. They stood panting, their foreheads resting against each other. The air was charged, the desire between them a living, breathing thing. But there was fear, too, a deep and profound terror of what they were becoming to each other, of what this fierce, painful connection might demand of them. They were both afraid of the fire, and they had both been burned before. They had taken one step over a line, and now, terrified, they both took one step back. The aftermath of their kiss left a new, volatile element in the cabin's atmosphere. They moved around each other with a strained, careful choreography, a painful awareness in every accidental brush of hands, every shared glance across the small table. The physical space had not shrunk, but the emotional space between them had become a chasm of unspoken words and a minefield of unspoken desires. They had stepped to the edge of a precipice and, terrified, had retreated. But the knowledge of the drop, the dizzying possibility of the fall, remained. The change in the world outside came first as a sound. The constant, mournful sigh of the wind began to deepen, its voice shifting from a lament to a low, guttural snarl. Eli, who had been mending a bridle near the hearth, stopped his work and went to the door. He opened it a crack, and a blast of frigid, violent air tore into the room, sending ashes skittering from the fireplace. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at a sky that had turned the color of lead. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "Blizzard," he said, his voice grim as he pushed the door shut and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. A bad one. His usual economy of movement was gone, replaced by a focused, urgent energy. He pulled on his heaviest coat and hat. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anything." Without another word, he was gone, disappearing into the swirling gray twilight. She watched from the window as he fought his way to the barn, his form a dark shape against a world that was quickly losing its edges, the air thick with a flurry of hard, stinging ice pellets. He returned a half-hour later, his beard and eyebrows white with frost, his face raw from the wind. He was carrying a final, massive armload of firewood, which he stacked neatly by the hearth. He had done what he could for the horses. He told her, packing the barn with extra hay and checking the walls for any weakness. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. And so they waited. The world outside ceased to exist. The sky and the land dissolved into a single, churning vortex of white. The sound of the wind rose to a deafening, ceaseless shriek, a physical force that seemed to press against the cabin from all sides, seeking entry. It clawed at the roof, rattled the window pane, and found every tiny chink in the logs to send razor-thin drafts of cold slicing into their small sanctuary. The cabin, once a haven, began to feel like a ship tossed on a raging, frozen sea. The first day blurred into the second. They spoke little, their voices small and lost against the storm's fury. The hours were marked by the simple, repetitive acts of survival, tending the fire, melting snow for water, eating their meager meals. The tension that had existed between them before was now magnified 100-fold by their confinement. The small room was their entire universe, and they were the only two souls in it. Every breath he took, every rustle of her skirts, was an event in the profound, roaring silence. By the third day, a new and more terrifying enemy began to make its presence felt. The cold. Not the drafts from the walls, but a deeper, more pervasive chill that the fire could no longer hold at bay. Evelyn watched with growing dread as the wood pile beside the hearth dwindled. Eli had begun to ration the logs, adding one only when the flames burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers. The warmth receded, pulling back toward the fireplace until only a small circle of the room was truly habitable. The corners of the cabin surrendered to the frost, which crept up the walls in beautiful, deadly white ferns. They spent their time huddled near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they possessed. The cold was a patient predator, stalking them from the edges of the room. It stiffened their limbs and stole the heat from their bones. Soon, even sitting side by side was not enough. The unspoken became a necessity. "We'll have to share the blankets," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, his face grim in the dying firelight. He did not look at her as he said it. It was a practical statement, not an invitation. It was about survival. She simply nodded, her own teeth chattering too much to form words. He arranged the blankets on the floor in front of the hearth, creating a single, shared pallet. He lay down on his side, his back to the room, leaving a small space for her, with a heart that beat a slow, heavy drum of fear and something else she could not name. She lay down behind him, pulling her own blanket over them both. The arrangement was chaste, a careful distance of a few inches maintained between their bodies. But in the profound cold, it was an agony. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a promise of life just out of reach. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The tension that had been a crackle in the air was now an electric current humming between their bodies. A silent, unbearable scream. The nearness of him was a torment, a reminder of the kiss they had shared, of the desperate connection they had both felt and fled from. Hours passed. The fire burned lower and lower, its light a fading memory. The cold intensified its assault, seeping through the floorboards, through the blankets, through their clothes. Evelyn shivered uncontrollably, her body a tight knot of misery. The cold was not just in her skin and bones anymore. It felt as if it had found its way inside her, touching the old, frozen places in her soul, the loneliness of the orphanage, the chill of the muddy street in Redemption, the icy despair of a future that had died before it was born. She could not bear it. She could not bear the cold outside or the cold inside, not for one more minute. The chasm of a few inches between her body and Eli's became the most desolate place in the world. In the darkness, with the storm howling its rage, all the rules of propriety, all the fear and hesitation became meaningless. There was only the cold and the simple, animal need for warmth, for contact, for life. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his shoulder. He stiffened at her touch, his whole body going rigid, but he did not pull away. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, raw with a need that went far beyond the physical. "Just hold me." She shifted closer, until her front was pressed against the solid wall of his back. "I don't want to feel cold anymore. Not outside, not inside." For a long moment, he did not move. She thought he would refuse, that he would retreat back into his fortress of solitude and honor. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he rolled onto his back and turned toward her. In the faint, ruddy glow of the last embers, she could see his face. The hardness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same desperate loneliness, the same deep, aching hurt. He lifted a hand and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was a revelation, a spark of warmth in the vast, freezing darkness. He said nothing. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. He was just as lost, just as scarred, just as hungry for a moment of solace as she was. He opened his arms, and she went into them without a second thought. His embrace was strong, solid, a harbor from the storm. She pressed her face into the rough wool of his shirt, breathing in his scent of pine and smoke. He held her close, his hand stroking her back, his chin resting on the top of her head. For a long time, they just lay there, holding each other, two broken pieces fitting together in the dark. It was not about desire, not yet. It was about the simple, profound comfort of one human being holding another against the cold. But the closeness, the shared warmth, the silent admission of need began to shift into something else. The desperate clinging softened into a more deliberate touch. His hand moved from her back to her hair, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. She lifted her head and looked at him. The space between them was no longer a chasm, but a breath, a heartbeat. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like their first kiss, which had been a collision of pain. This was slow, quiet, and searching. It was a question, and she answered by kissing him back, her hands coming up to cup his face. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a careful exploration of hurts and hopes. Their movements were slow, unhurried, as they undressed each other in the near darkness. There was no fevered passion, no wild abandon. It was a shedding of armor, a revealing of scars, both literal and figurative. When they finally came together, it was with a quiet reverence, a sense of awe that they had found their way to this place. It was not perfect. It was clumsy and hesitant at times, a language their bodies were learning to speak for the first time. But it was real. It was two people, stripped of everything but their shared pain and their shared humanity, finding a moment of grace in each other's arms. It was a communion, a prayer against the darkness, a raw, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly beautiful act of survival. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blankets, their bodies slick with sweat, their breath mingling in the cold air. The storm still raged outside, but inside the circle of their arms, there was a profound and fragile peace. And then, a sound broke the stillness, a soft, choked sob. Tears were streaming down Evelyn's face, silent and hot. She was not weeping for sadness or for joy, but for the sheer, overwhelming release of it all. The years of running, of being alone, of holding herself together with sheer will, had finally broken. Eli held her closer, his hand stroking her hair. "Evelyn," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "What is it?" She pressed her face into his chest, her words muffled by his skin. "It hurts," she sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of her. "But I don't want to run anymore." He did not offer empty platitudes or easy comforts. He simply held her, letting her weep, absorbing her pain as if it were his own. He understood. He knew what it was to hurt, and he knew what it was to run. And in the darkness of the snowbound cabin, he held her until her tears subsided, until she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep in the safety of his arms. The world they woke to was silent. The wind had died, and the sudden quiet was as startling as its previous roar. A brilliant, painful light streamed through the window, reflecting off a landscape transformed. Everything was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The storm was over. They dressed in a new, comfortable silence and stepped outside. The air was frigid and still, the sunlight on the snow blinding. And then they saw it, the barn, or what was left of it. The great, heavy roof had collapsed inward under the immense weight of the snow. Its massive central beam snapped like a twig. The sturdy walls had splayed outward, leaving a jumble of splintered wood and broken timbers. Eli let out a strangled cry and began to run, plunging through the waist-deep snow toward the wreckage. Evelyn followed, her heart in her throat. His horses, they had been inside. They reached the ruin and began to tear at the splintered boards, their hands raw and bleeding. They found the first horse, his big gray, dead, its neck broken by a fallen beam. The other, a sturdy mare named Bess, was alive, but trapped. One of her hind legs crushed and twisted at an unnatural angle beneath the weight of the roof. She was whimpering, her eyes wide with pain and terror. Eli worked frantically, using a long piece of timber as a lever to try and lift the beam, but it was too heavy. The mare struggled, her panicked movements only worsening her injury. Finally, Eli stopped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He looked at the horse, at her mangled leg, and a sound of pure agony escaped his lips. There was no saving her. There was only one thing left to do. He turned and stumbled back toward the cabin, his movements stiff, robotic. Evelyn watched him go, her heart aching for him. He returned a moment later carrying his rifle. He walked to the mare's head and stroked her nose, whispering to her, his voice thick with unshed tears. He raised the rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. He sighted down the barrel, his finger on the trigger. He closed his eyes, but he could not do it. His hands dropped to his sides, the rifle hanging limply. He leaned his forehead against the mare's, and a single, ragged sob broke from him. The man who had faced down ranchers, who survived this brutal land, who had pulled a boy from a fire, was broken by this act of mercy. Evelyn walked over to him. She did not say a word. She gently took the rifle from his trembling hands. The weapon was heavy, cold. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she had seen enough suffering. She knew what had to be done. She stepped back, raised the rifle to her shoulder, and did what he could not. The shot was a single, sharp crack in the vast, white silence. The mare shuddered and was still. Eli slowly lifted his head, his face a mask of grief. He looked at Evelyn, not at the rifle in her hands, but at her face, at the steady calm in her eyes. He was seeing her for the first time, not as the fragile, destitute woman he had pulled from the snow, not as someone to be sheltered and protected. He saw a woman who understood pain so intimately that she could face it down and do what was necessary, no matter how terrible. He saw a strength that matched, and perhaps even surpassed, his own. He saw an equal. They stood there for a long time, in the cold, bright sunlight, surrounded by the ruins of the barn and the stillness of death. The world had been broken, but in the breaking, something new had been forged between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "We have to go back." She looked at him, confused. "Back where?" "To town," he said, his gaze turning from her to the distant, hazy line of the mountains that separated them from redemption. "This is not over. The rumors, the land, Calvin." His voice was filled with a new, hard resolve. "We can't hide from it out here anymore." She nodded, understanding. He was right. Running was over. Hiding was over. She looked at the wreckage of their sanctuary, at the endless, indifferent snow. Then she looked at his face, at the man who had shared his pain with her, and whose pain she now shared. "Yes," she said, her own voice clear and strong. "Together." The journey back to redemption was heavy with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the charged silence of unspoken desire. It was the quiet, resolute calm of two people who had made a pact without words, who had faced a storm and a death together and had emerged on the other side, altered. They rode side by side on the buckboard, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a simple contact that now spoke of a deep and irrefutable intimacy. They were not hiding anymore. They were returning to face the world, together. As they pulled onto the muddy main street, the town seemed to hold its breath, windows and doorways filled with watchful eyes. The whispers started immediately, a rustle of dry leaves in a cold wind. Eli pulled the wagon to a halt before the general store, his face set like stone, daring anyone to approach. He helped Evelyn down, his hand lingering in hers for a beat longer than necessary. A small, public gesture of possession and protection. Before they could even step onto the plank walk, the stagecoach, which had just arrived from the east, rattled to a dusty stop nearby. The driver, Silas, climbed down from his perch, stretching his stiff limbs. He looked over the few waiting townspeople, his gaze landing on Evelyn with a flicker of recognition. "Got a letter here for a Miss Evelyn Gable," he called out, his voice booming in the quiet street. He held up a crisp, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a black wax stamp. Every head turned toward her. A letter, official-looking. The town's collective curiosity was a palpable thing. Evelyn felt a tremor of apprehension as she stepped forward. A letter for her could only mean one of two things: a final, dismissive severing from the world she had left behind, or something to do with the man who was the reason she was here. She took the envelope, her gloved fingers tracing the unfamiliar, elegant script. "Thank you," she murmured. Silas grunted and moved on to his other cargo, with Eli standing silently beside her, a bulwark against the staring eyes. She broke the seal. The paper was thick, expensive. The words were not a personal correspondence, but a dry, legal recitation. It was from a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man charged with executing the estate of the late Mr. Calvin Bryce. Her eyes scanned the dense, formal language, her mind struggling to grasp the meaning. It spoke of contracts, of formal agreements, of a bridal passage paid in full, and then the crucial lines, stark and unbelievable, as the contracted and intended bride, for whom passage and arrangement were secured prior to his demise. You, Miss Evelyn Gable, are hereby recognized as a legal party to the estate. As such, you are entitled to the deceased's primary land holding, comprising 160 acres, and all structures thereupon, effective immediately. The letter trembled in her hand. The land, the burned patch of earth on the hill, it was hers. The words seemed to rearrange the very ground beneath her feet. She was no longer a destitute stray, a fallen bride, dependent on the charity of a stranger. She was a landowner, a woman of property. The irony was a bitter pill. The man whose death had stranded her had, in that same act, given her the one thing she had traveled 1,000 miles to find: a home of her own. She looked up at Eli, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She did not need to speak. He read it all in her face. He took the letter from her hand and his gaze swept over the page, his expression hardening. He understood the implications immediately. This piece of paper had just made her the most vulnerable and the most powerful she had ever been in this town. The news spread through Redemption with the speed of a prairie fire. It was in the way the whispers changed, from scornful gossip to covetous murmuring. Jedediah Kane and his men, who had been watching from the saloon, now looked at her with a different kind of intensity. It was no longer the contempt for a woman of loose morals. It was the sharp, calculating gaze of men who smelled an opportunity. They did not wait long to act. Eli was inside the general store, negotiating for the supplies they would need to rebuild his barn, when Kane and 2 of his ranchers approached Evelyn. She was standing by the wagon, the letter still clutched in her hand, her mind still reeling. "Miss Gable," Kane said, his voice now a slick, oily thing, completely devoid of its previous sanctimony. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect so false it was an insult. "A word, if you please." Evelyn held her ground, her back straight. "Mr. Kane, we heard the news," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the stagecoach. "A terrible tragedy. What happened to Mr. Bryce? But it seems fortune has smiled upon you in the end." He smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips. "That land of Bryce's, it's a hard piece of country. No place for a woman alone to manage, especially with the cabin gone." "I will manage," she said, her voice colder than she felt. Of course," he soothed. "But it would be a great burden. We, the other ranchers of this valley, feel a certain civic duty. We would be prepared to make you a generous offer. Take the land off your hands. Give you enough to see you back east, to a life more suitable for a lady." He was talking about her land. Her land. A fierce, protective anger began to burn away her shock. This man, who had publicly shamed her, now wanted to buy her future for a pittance. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that there was more to his offer than civic duty. "Why are you so interested in a hard piece of country?" she asked, her gaze steady. Kane's smile tightened. "Every parcel of land has its value. We are prepared to offer you $200, a handsome sum." It was then that Eli stepped out of the store, a heavy coil of rope in his hand. He took in the scene at a glance. The three men crowding Evelyn, the false smile on Cain's face, the defiant terror in Evelyn's eyes. He dropped the rope and moved toward them, his steps silent and menacing. "The lady is not interested in your offer." "Cain," Eli said, his voice a low growl. He came to stand beside Evelyn, a solid, unmovable presence. Cain's facade of civility dropped. "This is a business transaction. Maddox, it has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with him," Evelyn said, finding her voice. She looked directly at Cain, her fear transformed into cold fury. "And the land is not for sale." One of Cain's men, the same hot-headed youth from before, laughed derisively. "Listen to her. Thinks she's a cattle queen now. You have no idea what you're sitting on. Lady." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It ain't about the grazing. It's the water. The creek on that land. It runs year-round. It's the only reliable water source on this side of the valley. That land has water rights, and you don't even know what that means." So that was it. Not just land, but life, control. The ranchers wanted to control the water, and she was the only thing standing in their way. "Get away from her," Eli said, his voice flat and deadly. The young rancher, emboldened by his companions, took a step toward Eli. "Or what? Maddox, you gonna hide behind her skirts? Everyone knows you set that fire. Maybe you think you're entitled to a piece of what's left." It happened in a flash. Eli's fist shot out, a blur of motion, and connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The rancher staggered back, spitting a tooth into the mud. And then the street erupted. Cain's other man lunged at Eli, and soon it was a desperate, ugly brawl. It was not a heroic fight. It was a chaotic mess of flailing limbs, grunts of pain, and the thud of fists against flesh and bone. Eli was outnumbered, but he fought with a cold, desperate fury, his movements economical and brutal. Men poured out of the saloon to watch the spectacle. Evelyn screamed Eli's name, her voice lost in the shouting. She looked around wildly for help, for someone, anyone, to restore order. Her eyes fell on the sheriff's office. The door opened and Sheriff Miller, a man with a drooping mustache and a weary, perpetually disappointed expression, stepped out onto the boardwalk. He watched the fight for a long moment, his face impassive, before he finally drew his pistol and fired a shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed down the street, and the fight sputtered to a halt. Eli stood panting, a cut bleeding freely from his temple, his knuckles raw. Cain's men were nursing their own injuries, glaring at Eli with pure hatred. "That's enough," the sheriff called out, his voice lacking any real authority. He ambled over, his gaze moving between the combatants. "What's the meaning of this?" "Cain." "Maddox attacked my man without provocation," Cain said, his voice oozing self-righteousness. "We were having a civil conversation with Miss Gable about a business matter." The sheriff turned his tired eyes to Eli. "Eli, you want to tell me why you're brawling in the middle of my town?" "They were threatening her," Eli said, his chest heaving, "trying to intimidate her into selling her land." Sheriff Miller sighed, a long, gusty sound of a man who wished he were anywhere else. "Now, Eli, these are important men in this community. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." He looked at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Miss Gable, this town was quiet before you arrived. First this business with Bryce, now this. Maybe Mr. Cain is right. Maybe it would be for the best if you sold the land and moved on. It would solve a lot of problems." The injustice of it stole her breath. The law was not here to protect her. The law was here to keep the peace, and she was a disruption to that peace. She and Eli were on their own, utterly and completely. Eli stared at the sheriff, his eyes blazing with a contempt so profound it was almost silent. He said nothing, He simply wiped the blood from his brow with the back of his hand, turned, and took Evelyn by the arm. He led her away from the crowd, back to the relative quiet of the livery stable. Inside, the air smelled of hay and horses. He slumped down onto a bale of hay, his head in his hands. The fight seemed to have drained all the energy from him, leaving behind a residue of despair. "He's right," Eli said, his voice muffled. "You should sell, take the money and go. I'll make sure they give you a fair price. You can go back east, start over. You don't belong in this mess." He was trying to protect her. He was trying to push her away, back to safety, away from the violence that he believed he had brought upon her. She looked at him, at his slumped shoulders, at the blood on his face, and a powerful, fierce love for this broken, honorable man rose up in her. But with it came an equally fierce resolve. She would not run, not again. She knelt in the straw in front of him. "No!" He looked up, his eyes filled with a familiar, tormented guilt. "Evelyn, you saw what happened. They won't stop. They'll keep coming. I can't keep you safe if—" "I am not asking you to," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "This is not your fight. Eli, it's mine." She took a deep breath, the decision crystallizing in her heart, clear and hard as a diamond. "I'm not selling the land. I'm going to rebuild the cabin. I am going to live there." She held his gaze, letting him see the absolute certainty in her eyes. "With or without you." The words hung in the air between them. It was not a threat or an ultimatum. It was a declaration of independence. She was no longer waiting to be rescued. She was claiming her own life. He stared at her as if he were seeing a stranger. The strength in her, the strength he had glimpsed when she'd shot the horse, was now fully formed, a blazing fire, and it seemed to break something in him. The guilt he carried, the weight of the boy he couldn't save, the violence he had just committed, it all came crashing down. He looked away from her, his face a mask of anguish. "You don't need a broken man beside you," he whispered, the words ragged, torn from his soul. "All I bring is trouble. All I am is a ghost. You deserve better. You deserve a whole man, a clean start." This was his final retreat, his last desperate attempt to wall himself off behind his pain. He was offering her an escape, not from the town, but from him, and she would not take it. She reached out and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her touch was gentle, but her grip was firm. "You're not broken," she said, her voice soft but intense. "You're healing, and healing hurts. Eli, it's supposed to. It's the feeling of something knitting itself back together." Her thumb stroked his stubbled cheeks. "I know what it is to hurt. I've lived with it my whole life. But your pain, that's what I crave. Too. Not because I want you to suffer, but because it's real. It's the mark of a man who fought for something, who cared for someone. It's the proof that you are alive." Tears welled in his eyes, the first she had ever seen. He had built his walls so high to keep the world out, but she had walked right through them, not by tearing them down, but by showing him the scars on her own soul. He had seen himself as a ruin, but she saw him as a man in the process of being rebuilt. He let out a shuddering breath and leaned into her touch, a silent surrender. The fight was over, not the one in the street, but the one inside of him. They did not waste any more time in town. Together, they gathered the supplies they needed: saws, hammers, nails, sacks of flour and coffee. They loaded the wagon and drove out of Redemption, leaving the whispers and the stares behind them. They did not look back. They rode directly to the burned-out cabin on the hill. The place was a ruin, a black, skeletal scar on the landscape. The smell of cold ash and charred wood still clung to the air. It was a place of ghosts, of dead dreams. For another person, it would have been a place of despair. For them, it was a beginning. They started that same afternoon, side by side. They began to clear the ashes of the old cabin. It was back-breaking, filthy work. They shoveled the soot and debris into piles, their faces and clothes quickly becoming black with grime. They pried up the charred floorboards, revealing the solid stone foundations beneath. With every shovelful of ash, with every splintered board they removed, it felt as if they were clearing away not just the ruin of a building, but the ruin of the past. They were laying a new foundation, side by side. A few days later, they had to return to town for more nails. As they walked down the main street, the familiar hush fell over the onlookers. The stairs were still there, still filled with suspicion and judgment. Eli stopped in the middle of the street. He looked at the faces in the windows, at the men on the boardwalks. He had spent years ignoring them, living in a self-imposed exile built of his own grief. But now, he was not alone. He turned to Evelyn, in the full light of day, in front of the entire town. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, calloused now from her work, curled around his. It was a simple, profound gesture, a public claiming, a quiet defiance. He looked at the watching faces, his gaze clear and steady, and his voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried down the silent street with an undeniable power. She's the only soul who saw me and stayed. Spring did not arrive in the valley. It waged a quiet, relentless war against the winter. It came first as a subtle shift in the light, a softening of the hard, gray skies. Then came the sound of water, a tentative dripping that grew into a steady trickle, and finally a confident gurgle as the snowbanks wept themselves into oblivion. The land, frozen and silent for so long, began to breathe again. The sharp, sterile scent of ice gave way to the rich, dark smell of thawing earth. On the south-facing slopes, the first improbable shoots of green pushed their way through the muddy soil, and on the charred hill where a life had ended and another had almost failed to begin, a scattering of purple and yellow wildflowers bloomed, their fragile beauty a defiant testament to the resilience of life. The new cabin stood proudly on its stone foundation, the pale, fresh-cut pine of its walls glowing golden in the spring sun. It was smaller than the original, built for two people, not for the lonely ambition of one. It was a testament to shared labor, every log hewn and placed by Eli's strength, every board sanded and sealed by Evelyn's patient hands. They had built it together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm, their silences filled not with tension, but with the comfortable hum of mutual purpose. With the structure complete, Evelyn began the slow, deliberate process of turning the house into a home. She took a small patch of earth near the front porch, where the sun was warmest, and tilled it with a hand spade Eli had fashioned for her. There, she planted the small packets of herb seeds she had bought in town, rosemary, thyme, and mint. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that would have flavor and fragrance. She took the last of her meager savings and bought 2 bolts of simple, cream-colored calico and sewed curtains for the single-glass window. When she hung them, the harsh sunlight was transformed into a soft, diffused glow that filled the small room with a gentle warmth. One afternoon, as they were sitting at the small table Eli had built, a gust of wind caught one of the new curtains and sent it billowing into the room, knocking a tin cup from its hook. The cup clattered to the floor with a comical clang. Eli, who had been carving a new latch for the door, startled so violently that his knife slipped, nicking his finger. He swore under his breath and stuck the finger in his mouth, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. And Evelyn laughed. It was not a small, hesitant chuckle. It was a full, unrestrained peal of laughter that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. The sound was foreign in the quiet cabin, bright and clear and full of a life she had forgotten she possessed. Eli stared at her, the finger still in his mouth, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his own face. The sound of her laughter was more beautiful than the birdsong of spring, more welcome than the warmth of the sun. It was the sound of the final thaw, the breaking of the ice that had encased her heart for years. Their life settled into a new kind of peace, It was a fragile piece, built in the shadow of a violent past and under the watchful eye of a suspicious town. But it was theirs. The work was hard. The days were long, but they ended them together, sitting on the porch as the sky turned from blue to violet, their hands and bodies tired, but their souls, for the first time, at rest. The arrival of the stranger came on a warm afternoon in late May. Evelyn was tending her small herb garden when she saw the lone figure making its slow way up the path to the cabin. It was an old woman, bent and weathered as an ancient tree, walking with the aid of a gnarled wooden staff. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes small and dark, but sharp with an intelligence that had missed nothing in its long life. She was leading a tired-looking mule, which was laden with her few worldly possessions. Evelyn stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening in her chest. Strangers were rarely a cause for celebration in this part of the country. Eli, who had been splitting logs near the woodpile, set down his axe and came to stand beside her, his presence a silent, protective shield. The old woman stopped a few feet from the porch, her breathing labored. She leaned heavily on her staff and looked them over, her gaze moving from Eli's wary face to Evelyn's questioning one. "You're the girl," the woman said, her voice a dry, reedy whisper. "The one he sent for." "I am Evelyn Gable," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "And this is Mr. Maddox." "I know who he is," the woman said, giving Eli a brief, dismissive glance. "Everyone knows the man who watched the fire." She turned her attention back to Evelyn. "My name is Agnes. I worked for him, for Calvin Bryce. Cooked and cleaned for that man for nigh on 3 years, right up until the end." Evelyn and Eli exchanged a look. This woman had known Calvin, had been with him in the days leading up to his death. "He was a fool," Agnes continued, her voice filled with a lifetime of weary contempt. "A cruel, greedy fool who thought he was smarter than God himself. He talked, you see, talked in his cups, told me all his clever plans. Thought I was too old and stupid to understand." She fumbled with a strap on one of her saddlebags and, after a moment, pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was worn and stained, its pages warped by moisture. "He wrote it all down. A man like that, he has to admire his own cleverness on the page." She held the journal out to Evelyn. Her hand was gnarled and trembling, but her grip on the book was firm. "This belongs to you, I reckon. It's the truth of the matter. I'm leaving this valley, going to live with my sister's people in the Oregon country. But I couldn't leave without setting the record straight. A debt owed is a debt paid." Evelyn took the journal. Its leather cover felt cold and brittle beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Agnes gave a single, curt nod. "Don't thank me. Thank the Lord for a justice that finds men even when they try to hide." Without another word, she turned and began to lead her mule back down the path, a small, stoic figure disappearing into the vast green landscape. That evening, by the light of a kerosene lamp, Evelyn opened the journal. Eli sat across from her, his face grim as she began to read aloud. The entries, written in a cramped, arrogant script, laid bare the blackness of Calvin Bryce's soul. He wrote of his mounting debts, of the land he was about to lose to the bank, of his hatred for the ranchers like Jedediah Cain who were circling him like vultures. And then he laid out his plan. It was as cruel as it was cunning. He had spent his last dollars to bring a bride from the East, a woman with no family and no connections. Her arrival would be the linchpin of his scheme. On the night before she was due to arrive, he would set a small, controlled fire in his barn. He would place a few of his old, worn-out clothes inside. He would then disappear, riding south to a new life with the money he had secretly saved. The town would assume he had perished in the fire, and the mail-order bride? She would arrive to find herself a penniless, grieving fiancé, stranded and alone. He wrote of it with a chilling amusement, seeing her as a mere pawn in his pathetic drama, a loose end that would be easily swept away by the town's indifference. Evelyn's voice faltered as she read the words, a cold sickness spreading through her. This man had not just been a stranger she was to marry. He had been an architect of her ruin, a monster who had planned to leave her to a fate worse than the one she had fled. But the final entries told a different story. In the last days, a new element of fear had crept into his writing. He wrote of a confrontation with two men to whom he owed a great deal of money from a poker game. They had come to the cabin, their threats no longer veiled. They had given him one last chance to pay. The final entry was short, scribbled in a shaky, panicked hand. They are coming back tonight. They know I have the money hidden. They mean to kill me for it. The truth, in all its ugly, tangled complexity, was finally clear. The fire was not Calvin's small, controlled blaze in the barn. It was an inferno set in the cabin itself. It was not an accident. It was murder, committed by men who had come to collect a debt. But in their act of murder, they had inadvertently carried out the very deception Calvin had planned. He had died in the fire he had intended to use as his escape. Justice, blind and brutal and accidental, had found him in the end. The journal lay open on the table between them, a silent testament to the evil that had almost consumed her, and the lie that had almost destroyed Eli. The town had accused him of murder, when he had been the only one to try and save a life. They had scorned her as a gold digger, when she had been the intended victim of a cruel deception. The next time they went to town, they took the journal with them. They did not show it to the sheriff, whose weariness they did not trust. They gave it to Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman known for her sharp mind and her inability to keep a secret. Within a day, the story had spread through every homestead and ranch in the valley. The change was palpable. It was in the way people looked at them. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a grudging, hard-won respect. Jedediah Kane saw them on the street, and for the first time, he gave Eli a stiff, formal nod, an acknowledgement from one landowner to another. Mrs. Peterson pressed a small bag of lemon drops into Evelyn's hand at the counter, a silent offering of apology and solidarity. They had not sought the town's approval, but its arrival felt like the final piece of their new life clicking into place. They were no longer outcasts. They were survivors. They were home. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, Eli was working on the new cabin door. He had been carving it all week, his knife moving with a slow, loving precision. Evelyn came to stand in the doorway, watching him. He was not carving a fancy pattern. He was carving letters into the smooth, pale wood. She saw her own name first, Evelyn. The letters were deep and strong. And then, right beside it, he carved his own, Eli. The two names stood side by side, etched into the very entrance of their home. He stepped back to admire his work, the carving knife held loosely in his hand. He looked at the names, then he looked at her, and his face was full of a deep, quiet emotion she had never seen before. He was not a man of easy words or grand gestures. His love was like the cabin he had built, solid, sturdy, and meant to last. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers tracing the scars on her wrist before intertwining with her own. "This is your home now," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Our home." It was not a question. It was not a proposal in the traditional sense. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a truth that had been forged in fire and blizzard and bloodshed. It was the most beautiful promise she had ever been given. She did not need a ring. She had her name carved into the heart of their life, beside his, in the final scene of that long, hard season. They sat together on the new porch steps, watching a summer storm roll in from the west. The sky was a dramatic canvas of bruised purple and angry gray clouds, shot through with veins of distant lightning. The air grew cool and heavy, smelling of rain and damp earth. It was the kind of storm that would have once terrified her. a reminder of the violent, unpredictable forces that could tear a life apart. But now, sitting beside Eli, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, it was just beautiful. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid, steady strength of him. The journey had been long, the pain almost unbearable. Scars remained, on her skin and on her soul. They always would. But they were no longer just marks of suffering. They were reminders of what she had endured, of the strength she had found. She whispered into the growing twilight. The words meant only for him. "It still hurts sometimes, but I don't want it to stop." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. He understood. The pain was the echo of the past, the proof that the wounds had been real. But it was also the texture of their love, the thing that gave it its depth and its meaning. It was the friction that created the warmth. Eli looked out at the approaching storm, unafraid. That's how you know it's real. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We'd love for you to comment with where you're listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.